Now, every state has its own weird laws and quirks, and I did hear at one point that in Arkansas, it was actually illegal to keep your alligator in a bathtub. Why does that law need to exist? I'm not sure, but it's kind of funny. Now, speaking of laws, getting to know the Arkansas landlord-tenant laws that involve a lease agreement is the key to having a good leasing relationship. Now remember, every tenancy is different, so it's par for the course to come across obstacles along the way. If this is the case, the best thing you can do is be prepared for any outcome. And by that I mean, I am not an attorney, this is not legal advice. I would definitely recommend that for your specific case, you reach out to an attorney in your area to help you. So, as the name states, these laws establish the rules and regulations that a landlord and a tenant both must follow at all times. Now thankfully, Arkansas is a state that doesn't really require too many guidelines for landlords or tenants, meaning there's room for flexibility on every agreement, except the alligators. There's no budging on that. So what I'm going to do in this video is go through Arkansas landlord-tenant laws to help you understand most of the things involved with renting a property. Keep in mind that this is general information and you may apply it differently depending on your case. Like I said, if you need specific help for your tenancy, make sure to contact an attorney or real estate manager for legal advice. So unlike some other states, Arkansas is actually considered a heavily landlord-friendly area. It doesn't really impose too many regulations on Arkansas landlords, meaning that they may manage their rental property pretty much in any way they please. In essence, they give a high grade of leverage to landlords over tenants regarding housing rights. So a lease agreement should be written if the lease term is longer than 1 year. However, it's always recommended that landlords use written leases regardless of the duration of the term, since it serves as physical proof of everything that was agreed upon between the landlord and the tenant. All of the housing guidelines for Arkansas landlord-tenant laws are specified in the Arkansas Code Title 18, Chapter 17. Landlords may include as many clauses as they consider appropriate, as long as they're compliant with Arkansas law. So some of the most commonly included clauses for this type of document include a description of the leased property, the duration of the lease term, cost of rent payment conditions, subletting and if it's applicable or not, and the person responsible for the maintenance and utility bills. If you're looking for your own lease agreement, you can actually visit our website and check out the forms page where we have a free PDF or Word template that you can download. So in every lease agreement, there's a specific section regarding rights and responsibilities. That section tells both landlords and tenants what they can and cannot do while the tenancy is active. Now these guidelines may be adjusted depending on the landlord, but generally speaking, they're usually pretty similar. According to Arkansas law, these are some important things that you should always keep an eye out for. So Arkansas landlords have the right to collect rent payments, collect a security deposit to cover excessive damage to the property, and pursue an eviction claim if the tenant ever violates the terms of the lease. Now, as far as responsibilities go, landlords must give the tenant their property as it currently is. Generally, landlords aren't responsible for making any kind of repairs unless it's stated within the lease agreement. It's also important to note that an Arkansas tenant may not pursue legal action if the repair request doesn't get honored. According to landlord-tenant law in Arkansas, there is no warranty of habitability. So this means that the landlord doesn't have to comply with specific health or safety codes when delivering the unit to the tenant. However, it's the tenant's duty to keep that unit in the same health and safety conditions that they received it in. As far as rights go, Arkansas tenants have the right to seek a rental unit without being discriminated against by their landlord. On the other hand, tenant rights also allow them to report any safety or health violations to the local authorities. As I said before, a lot of the responsibilities fall on the tenants in Arkansas. Since the landlord isn't required to make any repairs or maintenance to the unit unless stated otherwise in the lease agreement, tenants are responsible for keeping the unit in good repair at all times. And aside from that, tenants are also responsible for keeping the unit clean and safe, not disturbing other neighbors or tenants, and paying rent on time. It's important to note that tenants cannot withhold rent payments or deduct repair costs from future rent payments since it goes against Arkansas law. So while everything points to the fact that landlords have much more leverage over tenants, there's still a set of general clauses that are important to look at. So if you want your lease to be compliant with Arkansas law, listen to me very, very carefully. So as with most states, Arkansas tenants should be paying rent at the beginning of each month unless stated otherwise by the landlord. It's also important to note that Arkansas landlords don't have to send a rent receipt for tenants. However, it's always recommended to do as it's just considered good practice. Currently, there are no rent control policies in Arkansas, meaning that landlords are free to charge any amount that they consider appropriate. Additionally, they can increase rent really as much as they want without giving much notice to the tenant. However, they cannot increase rent as a retaliatory measure. Now, at the time of making this, there are no known late fee or grace period laws in Arkansas, so this means that Arkansas landlords can choose to charge late fees to their tenants if they wish. It's always recommended to charge these fees since this helps motivate the tenant to pay on time, and since there are no grace periods, landlords can charge late fees as soon as the rent is late. So security deposit can be collected to cover damages to the apartment or violations to local housing codes. It can also be used to cover unpaid rent or utilities. Now, according to Arkansas landlord-tenant laws, the security deposit's value cannot be higher than the cost of 2 months' worth of rent. Arkansas landlords are not required to provide a tenant the receipt of the security deposit. As far as returning the security deposit, landlords must return the security deposit to the tenant within 60 days of them leaving the apartment just to comply with local housing law. And if the landlord doesn't return the deposit within that time frame, tenant rights allow them to seek out legal help with a lawyer or file a claim in the small claims court. So what can a landlord partially withhold the security deposit for? They can hold it to cover unpaid rent or utilities, excessive damage to the building, or violations to the lease or housing regulations. Regardless of the case though, the landlord must provide an itemized list of deductions to the tenant within 60 days of the tenant leaving. So tenants can terminate the agreement if they want. However, they must provide a written notice to the landlord. And different types of tenancy need different types of notice. So if it's a weekly lease, it needs a 7-day notice. A monthly lease, a 30-day notice. And quarterly and yearly leases aren't applicable. On the other hand, tenants can terminate an agreement before it ends for any of the following reasons. If there's an early termination clause, any sort of breach of the lease terms or housing rules, or active military duty. So an eviction is what happens when the landlord decides that the tenant is no longer fit to live in their rental building. In these cases, the landlord has to give a particular amount of eviction notice to the tenant depending on the case. There are a few reasons that evictions take place, like unpaid rent. So if the tenant isn't successful at paying rent on time, the landlord can begin the eviction process within 5 days since they're not required to send any notice. This eviction process is also called the unlawful detainer claim. In the case that tenants are violating housing rules, landlords must send a 14-day written notice to cure or quit, basically saying you got 14 days to either fix it or get out. Now, if the tenant is seen doing any illegal activity on the building or on the property, they can send an unconditional written notice of eviction. In this case, if the tenant doesn't leave within 3 days' notice, the landlord can then seek legal action. It's important to note that at-will tenants must receive a 30 days notice if they're on a monthly lease. Additionally, Arkansas law also prohibits self-help evictions. Yes, tenants must know about any concentrations of lead-based paint in the rental building if it was built before 1978. So to comply with housing, health, and safety rules, landlords are the ones responsible for changing the locks of the rental building if the tenant requests it due to domestic abuse cases. In these cases, landlords must provide a copy of the new keys of the rental building to comply with housing rules. Entry notice for landlords is a very important thing in every single agreement. In Arkansas, the minimum or maximum entry notice isn't really specified, which basically means that landlords are not required to give notice of entry before going inside of the rental building. Now, that being said, it is generally seen as good practice in the housing market to send an entry notice either way just to prevent any disputes in the future. This notice can go from 1 to 2 days just depending on what the tenant and landlord agree upon. A small claims court in Arkansas can hear rental cases valued up to $5,000. So by making sure you're following all of these guidelines, you're ensuring a healthy and safe leasing experience until the very end. And as I said, if you need help with your specific case, please contact an attorney or real estate manager. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.